Hello and welcome back to the Reapers. So we're punching through your questions, and today we've got a new question from QC Plume Zoom 2. Can you show how notching physically works? So we assume we're talking about radar notching here. So today we're going to talk about radar notching. Now the difficult thing about this video is I've got to show to you in a 5 or 10 minute video the ideas of notching and how they apply to everything in DCS. So that's radars, air-to-ground radars, air-to-air radars, ground-to-air radars from the early 50s all the way up to 2010. So that's 6 decades of radar advancement that we're going to try and cover in one video. This means we're going to have to oversimplify, we're going to have to generalize and have some almost idealistic concepts, but still it will be accurate to just about everything we do in DCS. First thing we need to explain, there are generally 2 types of search and acquisition radar that we can use. 1, pulse Doppler. 2, pulse. So this first example here is pulse Doppler. First thing we're going to talk about is what is notching. So first of all, let's take the official spiel here. Notching refers to going into your opponent's Doppler notch. Essentially, radar uses multiple techniques to separate ground clutter from true returns from the target. The primary method being Doppler shift separation. By knowing what wavelength or frequency of the radar waves you send out, you'll be able to tell certain things. Example, if you send a ping of wavelength A on a target, the ping will return a wavelength shorter than A if the target is moving towards you, while the ground returns a different wavelength. So you could see the ground clutter is present as blue color, while the true target returns are red. If the target moves closer and closer to the same closure speed as the ground, that is perpendicular to the radar beam direction, then the red becomes more and more blue. And when he reaches close enough to the beam, also called the notch when in look down, the fire control radar is unable to tell the difference, and he notches you. So a very simple physical representation. This here is our aggressor, this is our defender. He is not notching, he is not beaming, he is flying straight towards us. This guy here is our defender. In our second example, this is our aggressor. He is now flying a beam. A beam, originally a nautical term, means we are flying 90 degrees, either left or right to the aggressor. Flying a beam or flying the beam is not the same as notching or a radar notch. In the purest term, a radar notch is going to be flying a beam left or right and flying lower than the aggressor here. Often people will fly a beam at co-altitude with the aggressor or even above the aggressor, and they will call it notching, and they can probably just about get away with it. But the true notch is this guy here flying a beam and lower than the aggressor. So before we get into how notching works in terms of radar, we're just going to have a tiny minute on kinematics, because we do have effect on kinematics as well. So first example, our plane flies towards the aggressor here. He fires this missile. This red is a missile, and the missile has a very easy time hitting this plane because it goes straight towards him. It doesn't have to maneuver, and the closure rate is very high because this guy here is constantly moving towards us. If we're using flying a beam or notching for defensive purposes, which is usually what it's going to be used for, then in terms of kinetics, this missile will have a much harder time hitting our aeroplane. For a start, it has to turn because it has to add lead, because this guy here is flying probably almost as fast as the missile. Missiles hate turning. They only like going in a straight line. If they turn, they scrub mechanical energy off them and they get slower and they become much less useful. As well as that, it has to travel much more physical distance because the closure rate is much lower if the guy is flying a beam or in a notch. Next, we're going to look at the radar notch. We're just going to reiterate what we said here. So again, this guy is using a pulse Doppler radar. It's all about how this guy can differentiate this guy here from surrounding radar returns, i.e. terrain, other planes, weather, whatever. And like it says, it sends a pulse out of a known wavelength and a known frequency. When it bounces off this aircraft here and comes back, then due to the Doppler effect, which I'm sure you all know about, the frequency and the wavelength of the return will be different in comparison to the inevitable radar returns that come from other stuff, like I was saying, buildings and trees and grass and whatnot, because the closure rate of this guy here in comparison to the other returns. That is the essence of pulse Doppler. So this case, he'll be very easily detectable. This case, if he went down into a true radar notch, lower than this guy and moving perfectly a beam, the more accurate, the better this works in terms of going exactly 90 degrees to this guy's longitudinal axis. Well, in this case, because this guy is flying exactly 90 degrees to this guy's axis here, this guy is closing to this guy here at exactly the same rate as the other returns, the buildings, the grass, the trees. the background returns. So the pulse that returns from this guy here is going to have the same wavelength and the same frequency as the other returns. And so this pulse Doppler radar is not actually going to be able to see this guy and pick him out as an aeroplane. And you will either not be able to gain lock in the first place, or if you do have a radar track or a lock, you will lose that lock. That is the essence of how a radar notch works.
The notch is a filter, so the radar does detect it, but it is filtered. By the processing, so it ignored. The return is ignored.
Absolutely. So it does see the aeroplane, like it sees the building, like it sees the trees, but due to the Doppler filter, it does not filter it out as an aeroplane.
Yeah, the filter being the notch.
So that's that. Next, we're going to split it up further. To really understand this a little bit further, we're going to split it into 4 different categories. This is how I like to think about it, because these are the real scenarios that you're going to be seeing when you see the differences in the effect of trying to notch. In all 4 cases here, we have an aggressor and we have a guy trying to fly a notch. This one here has a pulse Doppler radar. These 2 here just have a pulse radar. A great example, really good way to learn this is to fly Tomcat, where you can physically choose if you have a pulse Doppler radar working or a pulse mode working. So this guy has a pulse Doppler radar. He is higher in altitude than this guy here. Therefore, this guy is flying a true radar notch. And what happens is exactly the same scenario that we had here. This guy is closing to this guy at the same rate as the background returns. Therefore, this guy becomes effectively invisible. Now we're going to change it, and this guy with a pulse Doppler radar is lower than this guy here. This guy is not flying a true notch now. He's just flying a beam. Now, the same still stands true, that although this guy is not cluttered in ground returns like this guy is still closing to this guy at the same rate that the ground should be closing to this guy. So in the purest terms, although this guy isn't getting surrounded by other radar pings of buildings and stuff, the Doppler filter is still blanking this guy out. It's not seeing him as a relevant target. It would think that maybe he's a balloon or a bird or something. Now, what we're going to see is that due to advancements in later radars with post-digital processing, this guy here can be seen, although he's flying a beam, can be seen better than this guy here. But in the absolute truest sense of a pulse Doppler radar, this guy technically is still going to be filtered out by the Doppler filter, and he's not going to be seen as a contact. Next is the guy with the pulse radar. This does not have the Doppler filter. It's just pure pulse. Now, the interesting thing about this is because it does not rely on the Doppler effect, you cannot notch it. So we've got a pulse radar, so say a Tomcat in pulse mode here. It's higher in altitude than this guy here, so this guy's been highlighted against the ground. Although this guy can't actually notch a pulse radar, because he has been highlighted against the ground and there is so much ground clutter, a pulse radar, again, will not be able to see this guy. And that's something that's interesting. If you ever use a pulse radar in DCS and you try and look down on a target, you just won't be able to see him. Again, there is extra stuff that we can add in later, but in its purest sense, you can't see it. And it's not due to the Doppler filter, it's just how a pulse radar works. Whether he was coming forwards or whether he was coming sideways, it doesn't matter. You won't be able to see this guy. Next, the aggressor has a pulse radar. He is below this guy here. This guy is notching at this point. And although he's notching, because the pulse radar cannot be notched, because it does not rely on a Doppler effect, this guy can be seen perfectly. So this guy, who is, well, flying a beam really, can be seen perfectly by pulse radar. This guy cannot, because pulse radar cannot distinguish between him and the ground, no matter what angle he's flying. This guy, in his purest sense here, cannot be seen by pulse radar, but things will change in post-processing. And this guy here, who's the only one here who's doing a pure notch, because this guy is a pulse Doppler radar, and he's flying lower than this guy, a beam, cannot be seen. So I explained these 4 episodes here because I find them really important and intrinsic to understanding how different types of radars work in these particular scenarios. And it's taken me 4 or 5 years to really learn this and start to get to master this. Now we're going to add a bit more meat to the bone. So as radars got more complicated, so let's get into an F-18 radar, an F-16 radar. We have the advent of the digital computer. And we could add in extra digital processing and intelligence to the radar to help overcome these things. It's going to be much harder to notch a pulse Doppler radar than in an older radar. IW, would you like to explain why post-digital processing would help be able to see this guy here? So where this guy is beaming above this guy here.
The radar would be aware that it's looking above the horizon, so it could reduce its notch filter because it knows it doesn't have to eliminate ground contacts. It could completely turn off the notch filter because it knows it doesn't have to eliminate ground contacts, and thus it would obviously pick it up because, as I said, it's not that it's not detected, it's just that the computer filters it out.
Exactly. So we're just adding a bit of extra post-processing and intelligence to say, look, he's above the horizon, he can't be ground, therefore I'm going to reduce my notch filter from plus or minus 30 knots, plus or minus 50 knots, whatever it is, and therefore it will be able to pick him up much easier. Before digital processing, we had a guy called a Rio, or a similar, a guy who actually operated the radar in the back that was changing between these different modes, changing filters, adding filters, reducing thresholds of filters, and so on. And then that, in time, was replaced by a computer in an F-18 and F-16. An example of this would be the F-4 Phantom. You've got a guy, this is before, proper digital processing. You had a guy sitting in the back, turning knobs, changing the threshold, changing the filters, all these buttons and stuff that he's got to do to help alleviate the problems of what we're seeing here, doing extra processing to try and find a target. If you go and fly a Tomcat as a Rio, you'll know exactly what I mean. To find a target that's down there in the notch, you've got to twist this knob, turn that threshold, open that gate, and so on. But as computers came in, that guy's job became redundant because it could all be done automatically, digitally. And the pilot doesn't need to think about changing these gates and threshold stuff. When you go and fly your Hornet, you go and fly your F-16, all of that's taken care of for you. It knows roughly what the enemy is doing from past returns that it's received from the enemy, and it will go and apply its own digital processing and intelligence to alleviate the problems that we're seeing here. Next, I'd like to talk about range and power. Everything that we've looked at here is subject to range and power. Range is proportional to power. The closer this guy is to this guy here, the more power, the more signal from his radar is going to get punched back, and the signal we get back is going to be stronger. The stronger the signal, the better we can see this guy. That's true in all radars in every single case. I'm just going to pick a random one here. Let's look at pulse radar here, trying to search for this guy who's flying a pulse Doppler notch here. We can't see him because he's shrouded in the returns from the ground and the terrain. If we are close enough to him, say 3 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles, there's so much energy being reflected off this guy's body and back to us that we can overcome that. How that works, I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade at that point. But, there is some basic intelligence in there that says there's so much energy coming back from this guy, it must be an aeroplane.
Be a bright spot against the background noise.
Exactly.
So.
And the same here as well. This guy is notching inside the Doppler filter, this guy's Doppler filter. But again, if he's so close, if he's, at a certain threshold, and the threshold depends on the size of this plane, the speed of this plane, the speed of this plane, how much ground return, the power of this radar, the weather conditions, everything, and too much to talk about. So when you get within a certain distance, this guy's notch no longer works. So what I'm trying to tell you there is that a notch only works until a certain distance at which this guy's just pure power of the ping will no longer work. So notching only works over a certain distance. There's no way of telling you what that distance is because every single example is going to be different. You'll never find two examples the same. So we've looked at notching hostile radars. What about notching hostile missiles? Well, here's a little example we picked out for you. So we've got the AIM-7 Sparrow versus the AIM-120. This is rather anecdotal. So we're talking about old AIM-7s here. We don't know about the new AIM-7s because it's very hard to find information we find. And this is about AIM-120s in general. An old AIM-7 will use a pulse radar. It doesn't have its own radar on board. It uses the mothership's radar, but that doesn't really matter. An AIM-120 uses its own radar. It has its own radar on board, and it works differently. That is a pulse Doppler radar, more modern type of radar. And from that, we can say that you can notch an AIM-120 and it will work well when it's gone active. It's turned its own radar on because it's got this type of radar. So that is now the AIM-120. You can notch it. If you get in the radar notch, you go lower than it, you fly exactly 90 degrees to it, you fly a beam, then you can notch that AIM-120 and it works. It works really well. You can dodge them pretty easily like that. Again, you have to be within the parameters. You have to be over a certain range. You have to be doing a certain speed and all the other thousands of parameters that apply to, or not thousands, but a lot of other parameters that apply. If we had, let's say, this example here, you were flying a beam and above this guy here, this guy is now an AIM-7, although technically it's actually the radar on this plane. But let's just say there's an AIM-7 flying towards this guy here. This would not work because this AIM-7 can't be notched, assuming that it's not against the terrain. So this guy here cannot notch an AIM-7. It's important to understand that how you dodge missiles depends on the type of radar that missile has. This would work because the AIM-7 pulse radar can't find you against the ground here. It's nothing to do with the Doppler filter or your closure or anything like that. Like we did an example here, an AIM-7 cannot find you against the ground. Again, technology and when digital processing started being added, it was much easier. But if you go and take an old AIM-7, try firing at someone who's highlighted against the ground, it just goes spazzy because of this deficiency.
One thing that you might want to point out at the end when you were talking about you can't notch an AIM-7 and stuff, and I know this might seem obvious because of our discussions, but the viewer might think, well, you can't evade an AIM-7 by turning perpendicular to it. You can, but that's an energy management thing, not a radar thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're talking kinematically, yes, you can dodge an AIM-7 just like a 120, but in purely terms of radar, you can't notch that radar like you could into... Yeah. Now,
the difference between a crank and a notch.
No, crank's purely offensive, RC. A notch is defensive.
That's correct.
And like we said, again, this is very idealistic. There are lots of factors that change and muddle this up and mush this up. You can always find errors in everything we're saying here because this is so complicated. There are so many things bolted on. There's so much digital processing. But the real raw concept we're looking at here will apply in all circumstances. Okay, we're in the cockpit now. We're not going to do too many examples. I just want to keep it really simple. I'm in an F-15 here. 20 odd miles, RC's at an F-15 there, with co-altitude at Angel 16. 3 examples. 1, we're going to fly towards each other and you'll see that I can lock him all the time. You know that, but I just want to show that as a control. Next, I'm going to have RC go into a proper radar diving notch to the left or to the right at distance, and you're going to see that he disappears and I can't get him back on my radar. And then thirdly, I'm going to show him doing a diving notch when he's close, kind of within 5 miles, and you can see that the diving notch won't work, won't help him because the power, the wattage, is going to be so high at that point that he can't notch. The reason I'm using F-15s, they're very simply modeled radars compared to the F-18 and F-16, and simplicity for this tutorial is good. First things first, just fly straight towards me. I just want to show what happens when you don't notch. Radar on, search for RC, there he is. Okay, just going to fly, just burn towards me, get this done quickly. Let's try and hit, let's try and ram each other. 12 miles. Cool. So interesting, but I had no problems following him all the way. Next, we're going to go to a diving notch. Okay, I've got him at 20 miles now. RC, please turn exactly 90 degrees either left or right and dive. So it's into a proper notch. So you're going lower than me and 90 degrees to me.
And turn.
Right, I'm just going to keep coming towards you now and keep trying to track you. Okay, so more aggressive. I'm starting to lose him, you can see. I've got him now in memory. We're not actually tracking him. And he's lost him. And he's completely off my radar scanner now, you see. I can't, my pulse Doppler filter means that I cannot pick him up against that ground. Now, if he went up instead of down, I would still lose him. But the distance that I pick him up again would be much higher. So it's much more effective for him to go down. Okay, the next thing I want to show, RC, if we just start again, please. This time is 20 miles away. He's going to go into a diving notch, but he's going to do it so close that my pulse Doppler radar can overcome the notch purely by the power of the return signal. And you can see that I can burn through is not the proper word for this. I like to call it a burn through though. Right, so we get to 5 miles. At 5 miles, you can go into an aggressive diving notch. It has to be very aggressive because we won't have much time at that point. Okay, go into a diving notch now, please, RC. So get that 90 degrees. And what we're going to see is that I've got so much power, look, even in the notch. Oh, I might even lose him. No, I've got him. I started to lose him at a minute. But even at 3 miles, at 3 miles, there's nothing he can do. I've got so much power hitting him and bouncing off, coming back to my receiver, that there's nothing he can do. Okay, RC? Thank you for that example. I'm going to pause it now. That shows the basic essence of how to do the notch. Okay, I'll just quickly show it reverse. You lock me up, please, RC. I'm on the nose, 20 miles.
Okay.
And I'll come in, I'll notch your radar. Okay, I'm going to notch him now. Now, how aggressively you do the notch depends on the scenario, and we'll talk about that in a second. So I'm doing a non-aggressive notch at the moment, not particularly aggressive. And you see I've beaten... No, sorry, that's not beating him. Tell me when I've beaten your radar. It'll go into memory mode and start flashing.
Okay.
The best way to check I'm 90 degrees is to use the RWR down there. Okay, I've beaten him now. So I'm going to pause it there, RC. So I know I'm still getting some beeping. That's just a delay on the RWR. I have beaten his radar there. So use an RWR like this to check that I'm exactly flying a beam. And I'll know I'm lower because I know how high he was, so I could see on my radar. And the only thing I wanted to add there, because this is a tutorial at the end of the day, is that the aggressiveness at your notch depends on the scenario. In this case, I didn't need to do an aggressive notch. He's 20 miles away. He's no danger to me at this altitude and at this range. So I could manage my fuel. I could, just go into a simple notch like this at mil power, 400 odd knots. That's fine. If for instance, we were getting spiked from a missile, say our AIM 120, or even more importantly, an AIM 54, the only way of beating an AIM 54 properly is an aggressive notch. That would mean, well, I'll show you an aggressive notch now, stand by. If it was a missile, then it would be full burn and aggressive. Really into it, pull 9G. That would be how to notch a missile and get as low and fast as you can. But like everything in air combat, is going to be depending on the scenario, the danger of the scenario that you find yourself in. Otherwise, those are the basic concepts. As long as you do it right, it works basically all of the time. Whether it's an offensive or defensive measure, it's primarily a defensive measure, but it can be used for offense if you add a recommit on the end. I would usually use it for defense and then pull away, but it's up to you if you want to recommit. That's a whole nother video. I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you later.